What if the answer to one of the most exciting discoveries in coin collecting was sitting in a jar on your shelf right now, and you had no idea? Today we are diving into one of the most underestimated coins in American history, the Jefferson Nickel, a small 5-cent piece that hides extraordinary secrets inside its design, its metal, and its story. Welcome, and stay close, because what you are about to learn might change the way you look at your loose change forever. Step 1. There it sits in the palm of your hand, a 1941 United States Jefferson nickel, 5 cents of American history pressed into metal during a moment when the entire world was holding its breath. This coin arrived at a turning point, minted just months before the attack on Pearl Harbor pulled the United States into the Second World War, and yet here it stands, quietly carrying the portrait of Thomas Jefferson on its obverse, as if watching history unfold with the same steady gaze he wore at Monticello 2 centuries before. The portrait itself was sculpted by Felix Schlag, a German-born artist who won a national design competition in 1938, beating out nearly 400 other submissions with his dignified left-facing likeness of the third president, a face that would define the nickel for decades to come. The reverse shows Monticello, Jefferson's beloved Virginia estate, rendered in clean architectural lines that Schlag refined after the mint pushed back on his original, more dramatic design. What many people forget is that 1941 was actually a high-production year, with the Philadelphia Mint striking over 203 million nickels, San Francisco adding more than 43 million, and Denver contributing nearly 54 million, massive numbers that tell you the economy was moving, defense spending was climbing, and America was gearing up for something enormous without yet fully knowing what. The composition of this coin is something worth understanding deeply because it tells a story that would change dramatically just 1 year later. In 1941, the Jefferson nickel was still struck in its original alloy, 75% copper and 25% nickel, the same sturdy, slightly magnetic-resistant blend that gave the coin its distinctive silver-gray tone with warm undertones when held in certain light. By 1942, that formula would be abandoned entirely when nickel became a critical war material, replaced by a silver-manganese-copper alloy that changed the coin's appearance, weight, and sound forever. The 1941 nickel weighs exactly 5 grams, measures 21.2 millimeters in diameter, and has a plain, smooth-edged details that matter enormously when you are trying to authenticate a genuine example versus something altered or misrepresented. Holding a 1941 nickel is holding the last breath of peacetime American coinage, a material fact that gives this otherwise common date an emotional weight that no mintage figure can fully capture. Now here is where the story starts to split into something far more interesting, because not all 1941 Jefferson nickels are created equal, and the differences between them can mean the difference between pocket change and a coin that commands serious collector attention. The Philadelphia coins carry no mint mark, the Denver pieces bear a small D beneath Monticello on the reverse, and the San Francisco examples show an S in that same location. And while all three are collectible, the condition and strike quality vary in ways that experienced eyes notice immediately. Collectors in the know pay close attention to the steps of Monticello on the reverse, because a fully struck coin with 5 or 6 clearly defined steps at the base of the building, what the hobby calls full steps, represents a much rarer and more desirable specimen than a softly struck example where those steps blur together. 1941 S in particular is known to have produced fewer full steps coins than its Philadelphia counterpart, making a gem-quality San Francisco nickel with a sharp, complete step count a genuinely exciting find. And then there are the double die varieties, subtle but real, where the die itself shifted microscopically during the hubbing process, leaving ghost-like doubling on Jefferson's eye, his coat lapel, or the lettering of liberty that only reveals itself under magnification. If you are holding a 1941 nickel right now and wondering what it might be worth, the honest answer is that most circulated examples in average condition trade for somewhere between 25 cents and a few dollars. Coins that spent their lives in commerce, rubbing against other metal, absorbing the oils of 1,000 hands, losing the fine details that collectors prize. But walk into a serious coin show or scroll through a major auction archive and you will find a different world entirely. One where a 1941 Philadelphia nickel, graded MS66 full steps by PCGS or NGC, the two leading professional grading services, has sold for figures approaching $400 to $700, and where exceptional gems at MS67 full steps have reached into the thousands. These are estimates drawn from historical sales and market trends, not guarantees of value, because the coin market shifts constantly with collector demand, economic conditions, and the simple unpredictability of what buyers feel on any given auction day. A 1941 D nickel in MS65 full steps might realistically bring $200 to $500 in today's market, while a 1941 S at the same grade could push higher if the full steps designation is confirmed and the luster is original and undisturbed. But none of these numbers are promises, and anyone who tells you otherwise is not being straight with you. Imagine the story of a collector in Ohio who inherited a small cardboard box of coins from her grandmother, tucked behind old letters and a broken watch in a bedroom drawer. Among the wheat cents and silver dimes, she found a 1941 Jefferson Nickel in what appeared to be original uncirculated condition. No wear, sharp devices, a cartwheel luster that spun under the kitchen light. She almost set it aside without a second thought, but something about the brilliance stopped her, and she brought it to a local coin dealer who immediately noted the sharpness of Monticello's steps. Submitted to a professional grading service, it came back MS66 full steps, a designation that transformed a 5-cent coin into something a collector paid over $500 to own at a regional auction. That is not a typical outcome, it is a rare one, but it is a real category of outcome, the kind that exists because coin collecting rewards patience, attention, and the willingness to look more carefully than the person before you did. So if you want to examine your own 1941 Jefferson Nickel with genuine purpose, there is a practical checklist worth following before you draw any conclusions. Start with weight. A genuine 1941 nickel should register as close to 5 grams as your scale allows, and any significant deviation deserves further investigation. Look at the color in natural light. The original copper-nickel alloy has a cooler, grayer tone compared to the warmer silver look of the later war nickels, and a coin that looks too bright or too yellow may have been cleaned, altered, or is simply a different issue than you think. Examine the rim carefully. A well-struck 1941 nickel should have a clean, even rim that shows consistent height all the way around, because a weak or uneven rim can indicate a die that was past its service life or a planchet that fed improperly into the press. Under a loupe or magnifying glass, study the letters in Liberty and in God we Trust for any signs of doubling, because verified double die varieties on 1941 nickels do exist in the specialist literature, and while they are not common, they are the kind of discovery that makes a numismatist's hands tremble slightly. And above all else, do not clean the coin, not with a cloth, not with a solution, not with anything, because cleaning destroys the surface microtexture that graders read like a fingerprint, and a cleaned coin is almost always worth dramatically less than an untouched one regardless of how pretty it looks afterward. The emotional pull of a coin like this goes deeper than metal and money, though the money is certainly real enough to pay attention to. There is something genuinely affecting about the fact that a coin minted in 1941 may have passed through the hands of a factory worker building aircraft engines in Michigan, or a mother buying groceries in Georgia while her son's draft number waited in a government envelope, or a teenager at a soda fountain in California who had no idea that December was about to change everything. These coins did not sit in vaults. Most of them worked, traveled, changed hands dozens or hundreds of times before a few survivors escaped into collections or forgotten jars. When you hold a high-grade 1941 nickel with original luster intact, you are holding one of the rare ones that somehow avoided all of that, preserved by accident or by the quiet instinct of someone who sensed, maybe without being able to say why, that it was worth keeping. That kind of provenance cannot be certified by a grading service, but it adds a layer of meaning that serious collectors feel in a way that is hard to articulate and impossible to dismiss. What makes this coin genuinely suspenseful is that the 1941 Jefferson Nickel in high grade with full steps is still out there in the world, in old collections that have never been properly inventoried, in estate sales where the family does not know what they have, in accumulations bought by weight that nobody has examined piece by piece. Professional authentication is always the responsible path before making any assumptions about value, because the difference between a coin worth $3 and one worth 300 or even 3,000 comes down to details that require trained eyes and calibrated equipment to confirm, not wishful thinking, and certainly not online estimates alone. The market for Jefferson Nickels in this era remains active and genuine, driven by collectors who understand the history, respect the artistry, and know exactly what a sharply struck pre-war nickel represents in the broader story of American coinage. So take your time, use good light, find a reputable dealer, or submit to a recognized grading service if something catches your eye, because the next great discovery does not announce itself. It simply waits for someone paying close enough attention to notice. And speaking of things hiding in plain sight, the next coin we are going to examine has a secret buried in its metal that most people have walked past 1,000 times without ever suspecting. And once you hear what it is, you will never look at loose change the same way again. Step 2. Pick up a 1943 Jefferson Nickel bearing the Philadelphia Mint mark, and you are holding one of the most quietly dramatic coins in all of American numismatic history, not because it is rare in the conventional sense, but because of what it is made of and why that decision was made at all. This is a wartime coin, a product of crisis and chemistry, born in a year when the United States government looked at the metal composition of its own 5-cent piece and decided that the country needed that nickel more than its pocket change did. The result was a coin unlike anything that had come before it in the Jefferson series, struck not in the traditional copper-nickel alloy that had defined the denomination since 1866, but in a special wartime composition of 56% copper, 35% silver, and 9% manganese, a blend that gave this coin a warmer, slightly different tone and a distinctly different feel in the hand. Philadelphia was one of 3 mints producing these wartime nickels in 1943, alongside Denver and San Francisco, and the Philadelphia issues carry a large P mint mark positioned above Monticello on the reverse, the first time in United States coinage history that Philadelphia had ever placed its initial on a circulating coin, a quiet landmark buried inside a denomination most people never thought twice about. The Philadelphia Mint struck over 271 million of these nickels in 1943 alone, a staggering production figure driven by wartime demand for coinage that could keep commerce moving while the nation poured its industrial output into the war effort. And yet within that enormous number, the quality and character of individual coins varies in ways that matter enormously to the collectors who study them today. Felix Schlag's portrait of Thomas Jefferson anchors the obverse with the same quiet authority it always has. But on a 1943 wartime nickel, the interaction between that design and the new alloy produces something visually distinct from the pre-war issues that preceded it. The manganese content in the composition gives these coins a tendency toward a slightly darker, more muted patina over time, and original uncirculated examples that have never been cleaned or disturbed sometimes show a rich, complex coloration, golden undertones layered beneath the silver-gray surface that experienced collectors recognize immediately as the genuine article. Jefferson's facial features, the sharp line of his jaw, the architectural precision of his coat collar, the confident set of his gaze, all of these details depend entirely on the quality of the strike and the condition of the dies at the moment that particular coin was produced. And in a year when the Philadelphia Mint was running its presses at wartime capacity, consistency was not always achievable. The reverse portrait of Monticello carries its own set of diagnostic details that separators of fine examples from ordinary ones rely upon, particularly the steps at the base of the building, where a fully articulated strike will show distinct, uninterrupted horizontal lines that collectors refer to as full steps, a designation that on a 1943 P wartime nickel represents a genuinely uncommon outcome given the pace and pressure of production during that period. When you look at the coin under magnification and the steps resolve cleanly, one after another, without merging or blurring into softness, you are looking at the numismatic equivalent of a survivor, a coin that escaped the compromises that the majority of its contemporaries could not avoid. The large P above Monticello deserves more attention than it usually receives, because it was not just a practical identifier. It was a policy decision with historical weight behind it. Before 1942, Philadelphia had never marked its coins with a mint mark because it was considered the primary mint, the default, the institution whose output needed no additional labeling. The decision to add the P to the wartime nickels was driven by a very specific practical concern. The government needed citizens and businesses to be able to distinguish wartime silver-bearing nickels from the standard copper-nickel pieces that would continue to circulate alongside them, and the oversized mint mark above Monticello, visible on all three mint's wartime issues, served as that signal. On the 1943 Philadelphia coin, that P is boldly rendered, larger than any mint mark that had appeared on a circulating American coin in the modern era, and its size and placement make it one of the most visually distinctive features of the entire wartime nickel series. What collectors sometimes discover upon close examination is that the positioning, depth, and crispness of that mint mark can vary subtly between die pairs, with some examples showing a slightly stronger impression and others appearing softer or slightly tilted, not dramatic enough to constitute a major variety in most cases, but the kind of fine distinction that specialist collectors notice and occasionally pursue with serious interest. Condition is the variable that transforms this coin from a common wartime issue into something a serious collector actively seeks, and understanding the gradations of condition requires thinking carefully about what circulated life actually does to a coin of this composition. Wartime nickels that spent years in active commerce developed a characteristic wear pattern. Jefferson's cheekbone softens first, then the high points of his hair, then the architectural details of Monticello flatten toward illegibility, and even lightly circulated examples lose the delicate surface texture that defines a mint-state coin. But the manganese in the alloy also makes these coins susceptible to a specific kind of environmental damage when exposed to moisture or reactive atmospheres, producing dark spotting or streaky discoloration that can devastate an otherwise attractive coin's grade and appeal. Original mint-state 1943 P nickels that have been protected from environmental contact since the day they left Philadelphia, whether in original rolls, old albums, or inherited collections that were never opened, sometimes emerge with surfaces that show full cartwheel luster and virtually no impairment. And these are the coins that professional graders and serious collectors respond to with genuine enthusiasm. A coin like that tells a story not just of its own survival, but of the care taken by someone, somewhere, across 8 decades, to keep it exactly as it arrived. The collector market for 1943 P Jefferson Nickels operates on a spectrum that most casual observers would find surprising, because the coin's wartime silver content gives it a baseline intrinsic value above face value regardless of numismatic condition, and that floor creates an interesting dynamic when authentication and grading enter the picture. Circulated examples in good to fine condition typically trade for modest amounts, often between 50 cents and a few dollars, reflecting their silver content and basic collectability without any premium for preservation or variety. Move into the extremely fine to about uncirculated range and values begin to climb meaningfully, with attractive problem-free examples bringing anywhere from $5 to $20 in today's market, depending on eye appeal and the absence of cleaning or damage. Reach into certified mint-state territory, and the numbers shift more dramatically. 1943 P nickel, graded MS65 by PCGS or NGC, the two most respected third-party grading services in the hobby, might realistically bring $60 to $150 in current auction conditions, while examples at MS66, with the full steps designation, have sold in the $200 to $500 range based on auction archives, though these figures are always estimates and never guarantees. The market for these coins moves with collector sentiment, silver prices, and the unpredictable enthusiasm of competing bidders on any given auction day. And anyone approaching this coin as an investment rather than as a historical object should carry that uncertainty with them at every step. There are verified varieties and anomalies within the 1943P wartime nickel series that elevate certain examples well beyond the standard pricing framework. And these are the coins that appear in specialist references and generate the kind of auction excitement that gets people talking. Double die obverse varieties, where microscopic misalignment during the die-making process left a secondary impression on Jefferson's portrait or the surrounding lettering, have been documented in this series, and while they are subtle enough to require magnification and trained eyes to confirm, authenticated examples carry meaningful premiums over unaffected coins. There are also known cases of off-center strikes, where the planchet fed improperly into the collar and the design was impressed off its intended center axis, leaving a crescent of blank metal on one side and compressed imagery on the other, the kind of dramatic visual anomaly that mint-era collectors pursue aggressively. In particularly extreme or visually compelling cases, authenticated mint errors from this date have attracted auction results ranging from several hundred to occasionally over $1,000. Though such outcomes depend entirely on the severity of the error, the grade of the coin, the credibility of the authentication, and the competitive energy in the room or on the bidding platform at the moment of sale. These are not typical results for typical coins, and presenting them as representative would be misleading. They are the outliers that define the outer boundary of what is possible, not the center of what is probable. Examining a 1943P Jefferson Nickel responsibly means starting with the physical facts before any numismatic judgment is attempted. The coin should weigh approximately 5 grams, slightly different from the pre-war nickel's identical weight, but the composition change means that a precision scale calibrated to the hundredth of a gram can sometimes reveal inconsistencies that warrant closer investigation if the number strays too far from expectation. The metal color in natural daylight should carry that distinctive wartime warmth, not the cool blue-gray of a copper-nickel coin, but something slightly richer, with the potential for golden or amber toning in the fields and recesses that has developed naturally over decades. Examine the rim carefully around the entire circumference of the coin, because an even, well-defined rim indicates a planchet that fed correctly and a die that was in adequate condition, while a rim that thins, flattens, or shows irregular height may indicate a problem with strike alignment or a die in late service. Look at the lettering, Liberty, across the obverse, the mottos, the denomination on the reverse, with a quality loop of at least 5 to 10 power magnification, searching for any signs of doubling, repunching, or unusual thickness that might indicate a die variety worth further research. And whatever you find, resist the urge to clean the coin or attempt to improve its appearance, because the numismatic market penalizes cleaned coins harshly, and a professional grader will identify surface disturbance that seems invisible to the naked eye, transforming a potentially valuable coin into one with permanently impaired market appeal. What makes the 1943P Jefferson Nickel so fascinating to hold 83 years after it left the Philadelphia Mint is the layering of stories compressed into its 5 grams, the chemistry of wartime necessity, the administrative boldness of placing Philadelphia's initial on a circulating coin for the first time, the sheer industrial scale of a mint producing hundreds of millions of pieces while the country fought across 2 oceans, and the quiet miracle of individual coins that survived all of that history in the condition they started with. Every collector who has ever opened an old roll of wartime nickels knows the specific feeling of scanning coin after coin in average worn condition, and then encountering one that still carries its original surfaces, where the luster moves across the fields in an unbroken wave and Jefferson's portrait resolves with a sharpness that decades of circulation would have erased. That feeling is not just aesthetic, it is historical, a direct tactile connection to a moment in American life that no photograph or document can fully replicate. Professional authentication through a recognized grading service remains the responsible path before any significant buying or selling decision, because the difference between a coin worth a few dollars and one worth several hundred or more comes down to verified details that trained specialists assess with tools and experience that no casual examination can replace, and the collector who approaches this coin with patience, curiosity, and realistic expectations is the one most likely to find genuine satisfaction in whatever the answer turns out to be. Step 3. Pick up a 1944 Jefferson Nickel bearing the Philadelphia Mint's large P above Monticello, and you are touching a coin that exists because of decisions made in the shadow of global war. Decisions about metal, about sacrifice, and about what a nation chooses to prioritize when survival is the only item on the agenda. This is the third year of the Wartime Nickel series, a continuation of the emergency composition that began in 1942 when the United States government redirected its nickel supply toward armor plating, shell casings, and the industrial machinery of modern warfare, replacing the traditional copper-nickel alloy with a blend of 56% copper, 35% silver, and 9% manganese that changed everything about how this coin looked, felt, and behaved in circulation. By 1944, that wartime formula was no longer an experiment or an emergency measure. It was the established reality of American pocket change, familiar to anyone who handled money in those years, and the Philadelphia Mint was producing these coins at a pace that reflected just how much the wartime economy had expanded. The Philadelphia striking in 1944 resulted in over 119 million nickels, a figure lower than the extraordinary 271 million produced in 1943, but still representing an enormous industrial output from a mint operating under the sustained pressure of wartime production schedules. What distinguishes the 1944 P from its predecessors in the wartime series is not dramatic rarity, but rather the accumulated context it carries. A coin produced midway through the conflict, in a year when the Allied landings at Normandy reshaped the trajectory of the war, and when American factories, American workers, and American coinage were all functioning as instruments of a national effort whose outcome was still not certain. The portrait of Thomas Jefferson on the obverse was still the work of Felix Schlag, the German-born sculptor whose design had won the 1938 competition that established the Jefferson Nickel series, and by 1944, that portrait had been refined by years of dye production into a familiar, settled image. Yet the interaction between Schlag's design and the wartime silver-manganese copper alloy gave the 1944 P a visual personality that separates it from both its pre-war ancestors and its post-war successors. The manganese component in the alloy is the element that most dramatically affects the coin's long-term appearance, because manganese oxidizes in ways that copper and nickel do not, producing a characteristic darkening or tunning that original uncirculated examples develop over decades into something collectors describe as complex and attractive when it occurs naturally and undisturbed. Fresh from the mint in 1944, these coins would have displayed a warmer, slightly golden-tinged luster compared to the cooler silver gray of the pre-war composition, and original rolls or album coins that have been sealed away from reactive atmospheres since the 1940s sometimes still show that original surface character in a way that stops experienced collectors mid-examination. Jefferson's left-facing profile on the 1944 P carries diagnostic details, the precise rendering of his eye socket, the treatment of his hair queue, the articulation of his collar and coat that vary subtly between die pairs, and a coin struck from fresh, unworn dies in the early production runs of that year will show a crispness and depth of detail that late production strikes from tired dies simply cannot match. Monticello, on the reverse, is where the most consequential grading distinctions for this coin are determined, and understanding why requires understanding something about how the Jefferson Nickels design interacts with the physics of coin striking at high production volumes. The steps at the base of Monticello, those horizontal architectural lines that descend from the portico of Jefferson's Virginia home, are among the shallowest recesses in the entire design, which means they are the first features to suffer when die pressure is inconsistent, when the dies are beginning to show fatigue, or when the planchet metal does not flow completely into every corner of the design cavity. A 1944 P nickel with 5 or 6 fully separated, clearly defined steps at the base of Monticello is a coin that was struck with exceptional force and precision from dies in good condition. And because Philadelphia was producing over 100 million of these coins under wartime scheduling demands, the combination of factors was less common than the mintage number might suggest. The full steps designation, awarded by professional grading services when the steps meet their specific criteria for separation and definition, transforms a 1944 P nickel from a common wartime issue into a genuinely scarce collectible, one that specialists actively seek and are willing to pay meaningfully above standard prices to acquire. Beyond the steps, the overall relief of the Monticello design, the columns, the dome, the surrounding trees and landscape, tells a grader immediately whether the coin received a full, complete strike or whether the metal stopped flowing before the design was fully resolved, and that distinction is visible even without magnification once you train your eye to recognize it. The large P mint mark above Monticello remains one of the most historically significant small details in 20th century American coinage, and on the 1944 issue it carries particular weight because of how normalized its presence had become by that point in the series. When it first appeared on the 1942 P wartime nickel, that oversized Philadelphia initial was a genuine numismatic landmark, the first time in the history of the United States mint that Philadelphia had identified its own production on a circulating coin. But by 1944, it had been present for 2 full years and was simply part of the coin's established visual grammar. What collectors examining 1944 P nickels look for in relation to the mint mark is not its presence, but its character, the depth of its impression, the evenness of its serifs, and whether there is any evidence of a repunched mint mark, a variety that occurs when the punch used to impress the P into the working die was applied more than once, leaving a secondary ghost impression slightly offset from the primary. Repunched mint mark varieties on wartime Jefferson Nickels are documented in specialist references, and while they range from subtle to more visually obvious, depending on the degree of misalignment, authenticated examples with clear doubling of the P carry premiums in the collector market that can be meaningful relative to the baseline value of a standard example. These are the kinds of details that reward careful examination with quality magnification, and that separate a knowledgeable collector from someone simply sorting coins by date. The value landscape for a 1944 P Jefferson nickel is one that rewards patience and realistic thinking, because the range of possible outcomes for any given coin spans from genuinely modest to surprisingly significant, depending almost entirely on condition, surface preservation, and the presence or absence of premium characteristics. Heavily circulated examples in good or fine condition, coins that spent years moving through cash registers and coat pockets across wartime and post-war America, typically trade today for somewhere between 50 cents and $3 or $4, with the silver content providing a floor below which the price rarely falls regardless of numismatic condition. Move into the extremely fine range, where the high points show light wear, but the design remains crisp and the fields retain some original surface texture, and realistic values climb into the $10 to $30 range for attractive, problem-free examples without cleaning or environmental damage. Certified mint state examples graded by PCGS or NGC, the professional third-party services whose holders and grades the collector market trusts as its standard, tell a more interesting story. A 1944 P graded MS-65 might bring $60 to $150 in current auction conditions, while an MS-65 with the full steps designation can push into the $200 to $400 range based on historical sales data from major auction archives. These figures are always estimates drawn from past performance and never guarantees of what any individual coin will bring, because the market for collectible coins is shaped by factors no one can fully predict: the number of competing bidders, the strength of collector demand in any given season, and the simple reality that two coins graded identically can sell for different prices depending entirely on who is watching when the hammer falls. Exceptional examples and verified anomalies within the 1944 P series occupy a different tier of collector conversation entirely, one where documented auction results and specialist literature describe outcomes that most coins in this series will never approach, but that define the outer boundary of what is genuinely possible for a coin of this type and era. Off-center strikes, where the planchet was misaligned within the collar at the moment of striking, producing a coin where the design is offset from center with a corresponding crescent of blank metal, are among the most visually dramatic mint errors that collectors encounter in any series. And authentic examples from the wartime Jefferson Nickel series have appeared in auction at figures ranging from several hundred to over $1,000, depending on the severity of the offset and the grade of the affected coin. Double die varieties, where the working die received misaligned impressions during its own manufacture and transferred that doubling to every coin it subsequently struck. A subtler but equally documented: look for doubled outlines on Liberty, on the date numerals, or on Jefferson's facial features under magnification, because these are the anomalies that specialist collectors pursue with the kind of focused intensity that drives real price discovery. It is essential to understand that these outcomes are not representative of the typical 1944 P nickel experience. They describe rare circumstances involving coins with unusual characteristics confirmed by professional authentication, and anyone who encounters what appears to be an anomaly should approach it with curiosity rather than certainty, submitting it to a recognized grading service before drawing any conclusions about its significance or value. Responsible examination of a 1944 P Jefferson nickel begins with the physical facts of the coin itself, because the wartime composition creates specific diagnostic characteristics that help distinguish genuine examples from altered or misrepresented pieces, and that inform any honest assessment of condition. The coin should weigh as close to 5 grams as a precise digital scale can confirm, and while the wartime alloy shares this target weight with the standard pre-war composition, the different density of the silver-manganese-copper blend means that a coin significantly above or below 5 grams deserves immediate further investigation before any other conclusions are drawn. The color in natural daylight is one of the most immediate diagnostic tools available. Authentic 1944 P nickels have a warmer, slightly less purely silver tone compared to standard copper-nickel coins, and original surfaces often develop the characteristic manganese tunning that appears as golden, amber, or occasionally darker patina in the recessed areas of the design. Examine the rim under magnification, because a complete, even, well-defined rim indicates a coin struck from a properly prepared planchet with adequate die pressure, while a rim that shows uneven height, weakness in specific areas, or evidence of post-mint damage tells a grader immediately that something interrupted the ideal striking process. Study the lettering of MONTICLLO, 5 cents, and United States of America on the reverse with the same magnification you apply to the obverse, because the reverse lettering on wartime Jefferson Nickels sometimes shows the effects of die fatigue in ways that the portrait and building design do not make immediately obvious. And it is in that lettering where some of the most interesting minor varieties in this series quietly reside, waiting for someone with enough patience and the right tools to find them. There is a particular kind of satisfaction that comes from understanding a coin like the 1944 P Jefferson nickel not as a random piece of old metal, but as a compressed artifact of a specific moment in American history, a year when the country was simultaneously fighting the largest war in human history, producing coinage at industrial scale from a silver it had never used before, and somehow maintaining the commercial infrastructure of daily life through all of it. The people who handled these nickels in 1944 were buying war bonds, rationing gasoline, reading casualty lists in the morning paper, and dropping 5-cent coins into pay phones and vending machines and corner store registers without giving the coins themselves a second thought, which is exactly how most of them ended up worn, scratched, and spent, survivors only of ordinary life rather than deliberate preservation. The ones that escaped that fate, tucked into rolls by bank tellers, slipped into albums by young collectors, inherited and forgotten in cardboard boxes for decades, are the coins that now represent the upper range of what this date and mint can offer a serious collector, and they surface in estate sales, at coin shows, and through dealers who know what they are looking at often enough to remind the hobby that genuine discovery is still possible. Professional authentication and grading through a recognized service remains the single most important step between an interesting find and a confirmed collectible, because the distinction between a coin that looks valuable and one that is verifiably valuable is the difference between speculation and knowledge. And in a hobby built on precision, knowledge is always the more interesting place to stand. Step 4. Pick up a 1945 Jefferson Nickel with the large P mint mark above Monticello, and you are holding the final chapter of one of the most unusual and historically charged episodes in the entire history of American coinage. A coin that marks the last year the United States government would ever produce a circulating nickel from a silver-bearing alloy, closing out a wartime experiment that had quietly reshaped the 5-cent piece for 4 extraordinary years. This is 1945, the year the Second World War finally ended on both fronts, the year that atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the year that Franklin Roosevelt died in Georgia and Harry Truman inherited the most consequential presidency in modern American history. And through all of that, the Philadelphia Mint kept its presses running, striking nickels from that same wartime blend of 56% copper, 35% silver, and 9% manganese that had defined the series since 1942. The Philadelphia production for 1945 reached approximately 119 million coins, a figure that parallels the previous year's output and reflects the sustained industrial tempo of a mint still operating under wartime production logic even as the conflict moved toward its conclusion. What gives the 1945 P its singular character among the wartime Jefferson Nickels is not scarcity alone but finality. This is the coin that closes the series, the last wartime nickel, and that narrative position gives it an emotional and historical resonance that collectors feel even when they cannot always articulate exactly why a coin from a high mintage year commands the attention it does among serious numismatists who study this era carefully and completely. Felix Schlag's portrait of Thomas Jefferson faces left on the obverse with the same composed authority it has carried since the series began in 1938, but the 1945 P presents that familiar image through the specific lens of a coin produced in the final months of a global war, when the Philadelphia Mint's die shop, its press operators, and its quality control processes were all shaped by years of sustained wartime production that left their mark on the coins themselves, in ways both visible and subtle. The obverse design carries liberty arching above Jefferson's portrait, "In God We Trust" along the left rim, and the date 1945 at the bottom right, details that on a well-struck example from fresh dies appear with the kind of razor-edge clarity that collectors spend years learning to recognize and decades trying to find. The interaction between the silver-manganese-copper alloy and the striking process creates surface characteristics on original uncirculated 1945 P nickels that are genuinely distinct from both the pre-war copper-nickel coins and the post-war issues that followed, a luster that tends toward warmer golden tones in the fields, with the manganese component producing a surface texture under magnification that experienced graders describe as slightly different from standard nickel luster, requiring trained eyes to properly evaluate and attribute. Jefferson's cheekbone, the high point of the portrait most vulnerable to wear, is the first place a circulated coin reveals its history of use, and even slight friction there, the kind that happens after a coin changes hands only a few dozen times, begins the process of detail loss that separates a mint state example from one that has entered the world of circulation grades. A distinction that in this series can mean the difference between a coin worth a few dollars and one worth considerably more. The reverse of the 1945p is where much of the most consequential numismatic action occurs, and Monticello's architectural portrait carries within it the diagnostic information that separates an ordinary collectible from a genuinely premium example in the eyes of the specialist market. The building's facade, rendered in the clean neoclassical lines that Schlag refined under pressure from mint officials who pushed back on his original more expressive design, presents a series of horizontal steps at its base that function almost as a grading instrument built directly into the coin's own design. These steps, positioned at the base of the portico, running across the lower portion of the building, require exceptional die pressure and precise planchet preparation to resolve fully, and in a production year when Philadelphia was running presses at the volume necessary to produce over 100 million coins, the conditions required for every coin to emerge with fully separated, distinct steps were simply not consistently present. A 1945p nickel graded by a professional service with the full steps designation attached represents a coin where those steps resolved completely despite everything working against that outcome. A survivor of the production process rather than merely a product of it, and that distinction drives meaningful premium in collector transactions. Beyond the steps, the overall sharpness of the Monticello design, the definition of the columns, the articulation of the triangular pediment above them, and the crispness of the surrounding inscriptions all contribute to a holistic assessment of strike quality that experienced collectors evaluate as a complete picture rather than a checklist of isolated features. The large P mint mark above Monticello tells a story that goes beyond simple production attribution, and on the 1945 issue, it carries the particular significance of being the final appearance of that wartime identifier on a Philadelphia circulating coin before the series ended, and the mint mark was removed again. The oversized P, unprecedented in American coinage when it first appeared on the 1942 wartime nickel, had by 1945 been present for 3 full years, and yet its historical novelty had not diminished simply because it had become familiar. What specialists examining 1945p nickels look for in the mint mark goes beyond its mere presence. The quality of its impression, the sharpness of its internal serifs, and whether the punch was applied cleanly and consistently to the working die or whether evidence of a repunched application exists anywhere in the letter's profile. Repunched mint mark varieties occur when the hub punch used to press the P into the working die was applied more than once, either because the first impression was misaligned or insufficiently deep, and the resulting coins show a secondary ghost impression of the letter that is visible under magnification as a slight doubling or offset shadow within or adjacent to the primary mint mark. These varieties are catalogued in specialist references covering the Jefferson Nickel series, and while they range from barely perceptible to clearly visible, depending on the severity of the misalignment. Authenticated examples with confirmed repunching attract collector interest and carry premiums that reflect both their genuine scarcity and the specialized knowledge required to identify them correctly in the first place. The value discussion surrounding a 1945p Jefferson nickel is one that requires separating several distinct categories of coin from one another before any meaningful market context can be applied, because the range from a worn example worth its silver melt value to a certified gem commanding serious collector premiums is wider than most casual observers would expect. Heavily circulated coins in grades from good through fine, coins that spent their entire working lives as actual currency, passing through cash registers and change jars across the late 1940s, and through the decades that followed, typically trade today for somewhere between $1 and $5, with the silver content providing a reliable floor that moves with the spot price of the metal regardless of numismatic condition. Lightly circulated examples in the very fine to extremely fine range, where design details remain largely intact, but the mint luster has been replaced by the smoother surface of coins that saw limited commercial use, bring more meaningful prices in the $10 to $40 range for attractive, unaltered pieces that show no cleaning or artificial enhancement. Certified mint state examples are where the market becomes genuinely interesting. 1945p graded MS65 by PCGS or NGC might realistically bring anywhere from $75 to $200 in current collector market conditions, while the same coin with a full steps designation attached has appeared in auction archives at figures ranging from $250 to over $500 for the finest certified examples, though all of these figures are estimates drawn from historical sales data and market observation. Never guarantees of what any specific coin will bring when it encounters the unpredictable reality of an actual auction or private transaction. Rare circumstances within the 1945p series occasionally produce outcomes that exceed the standard value framework by significant margins, and these exceptional cases, while not representative of the typical collecting experience, define the upper boundary of what is genuinely possible for a coin of this date and mint, when unusual characteristics combine with exceptional preservation and strong collector demand. Mint errors represent the most dramatic category of premium example. A 1945p nickel struck off-center, where the planchet sat askew within the collar at the moment of striking and emerged with the design displaced toward one side and a corresponding blank crescent on the other, is a visually arresting anomaly that error collectors pursue with considerable intensity. Authenticated off-center strikes from this series have appeared at auction with results ranging from several hundred to over $1,000 depending on the degree of offset. Generally, the more dramatic the misalignment while still retaining a readable date, the more desirable the piece, though these results always depend on the specific characteristics of the individual coin, the credibility of its authentication, and the competitive energy present among bidders at the time of sale. Doubled die varieties represent a subtler but equally documented category of premium collectible within this date, with confirmed examples showing secondary impressions on Jefferson's portrait, the date, or the obverse inscriptions that require magnification to identify, but that professional authentication can verify with certainty. These are not the coins that most people will find in their pocket change or inherited collections, but they are real, they are documented, and they are the reason that a careful examination of any 1945p nickel is always worth conducting before the coin is spent, traded, or set aside without a second thought. Examining a 1945p Jefferson nickel with genuine numismatic purpose requires applying a consistent, methodical approach that begins with the physical characteristics of the coin and works outward toward more nuanced assessments of design quality and potential variety attribution. Weight is the starting point. A genuine 1945p nickel should register as close to 5 grams as your scale allows, and the silver manganese copper alloy that comprises this coin has a density profile that a precision digital scale will confirm within a reasonable tolerance on an authentic example. Significant deviations from that target deserve further investigation before any other conclusions are drawn. Color in natural daylight provides immediate information. The wartime alloy produces a distinctly warmer tone than the standard copper-nickel composition, and authentic original surface examples often show the characteristic golden or amber toning in the coin's recessed areas that results from decades of natural manganese oxidation. Examine the strike alignment by checking whether the obverse and reverse designs are centered relative to the coin's physical edges. A coin where the design is noticeably displaced toward one side without being a deliberate mint error may indicate a planchet or feeding issue worth noting. The rim deserves careful attention under magnification. An even, complete, well-defined rim all the way around both sides indicates a properly prepared planchet and adequate striking pressure, while a rim that thins, flattens, or shows distortion in specific areas suggests problems with either the planchet or the die that affected the quality of that particular striking. Lettering should be examined carefully for any signs of doubling, unusual thickness, or secondary impressions that might indicate a variety worth researching in specialist references. And all of this examination should be conducted without touching the coin's surfaces with anything, because even the oil from a fingertip can begin the process of degradation that decades of careful preservation had previously prevented. What the 1945 P. Jefferson Nickel ultimately offers the collector who approaches it with curiosity and patience is a genuine intersection of American history, metallurgical rarity, and numismatic depth that rewards careful attention in ways that far more expensive coins sometimes do not. This is a coin that was produced in the final year of a wartime emergency that had reshaped American coinage from the ground up, struck from a silver alloy that the government had improvised out of necessity and would abandon the moment the war ended, bearing a mint mark that had never appeared on a Philadelphia coin before the crisis demanded it. And all of that history is compressed into 5 grams of metal small enough to sit comfortably on your thumbnail. The collectors who find the most satisfaction with coins like this are the ones who understand that value in numismatics is never simply about what a coin is worth today, but about what it represents as a physical artifact of a specific historical moment. And that understanding is available to anyone regardless of budget, experience level, or the size of their collection. Professional authentication and grading through a recognized service like PCGS or NGC remains the responsible path before any significant transaction, because the certified grade is not just a number but a verified statement about condition and authenticity that the collector market relies upon as its common language. If you found this journey through one of America's most historically layered small coins worthwhile, please consider subscribing, because there are more stories like this one, coins with histories as surprising and as human as this, waiting to be examined, understood, and shared with everyone who has ever looked at a piece of old metal and wondered what it might have seen. Step 5. Pick up a 1952 Jefferson Nickel, and you are holding a coin that arrived in American pockets during one of the most psychologically complex peacetime moments the country had ever navigated. A year when the Korean War was grinding toward its uneasy armistice, when television sets were appearing in living rooms across the country for the first time, when Eisenhower was preparing to end 2 decades of Democratic presidential dominance, and when the United States was simultaneously exhausted from a decade of global conflict and intoxicated by the prosperity that followed it. This coin is not a wartime issue. The silver-bearing emergency composition that defined the nickels of 1942 through 1945 had been abandoned 7 years earlier, and the 1952 Jefferson Nickel returned fully to the original alloy of 75% copper and 25% nickel that had characterized the denomination since the 19th century, giving it that distinctive cool silver-gray tone that looks and feels entirely different from the warmer wartime issues that preceded it in the series. The Philadelphia Mint, which produced the 1952 nickel without a mint mark, as was its standard practice for circulating coinage in that era, struck approximately 63.9 million of these coins, a number that sounds large until you consider what that production figure actually means in terms of survivorship across 7 decades of circulation, loss, and attrition. Denver added roughly 30.6 million pieces bearing the D-Mint mark beneath Monticello, and San Francisco contributed approximately 20.5 million with the S identifier in that same location, making the San Francisco issue the scarcest of the 3 by raw mintage. But scarcity of mintage and scarcity of high-grade survivors are 2 different conversations entirely. And the 1952 series rewards the collector who understands that distinction completely before drawing any conclusions about what any particular coin might represent. Felix Schlag's portrait of Thomas Jefferson on the obverse of the 1952 nickel had been a fixture of American pocket change for 14 years by the time this coin was struck. And yet the familiarity of the design should not obscure the genuine artistry compressed into its execution on well-struck examples from this date. Jefferson faces left, his composed and slightly idealized profile rendered with a sculptural precision that Schlag had originally developed for the 1938 competition, and that had been refined through years of die production into a settled, authoritative image. But the quality with which that image transferred from die to planchet varied meaningfully across the production run of any given year, and 1952 is no exception to that pattern. The obverse carries Liberty arching above the portrait, In God We Trust positioned along the left field, and the date 1952 anchoring the lower right, and on coins struck from fresh, unworn dies early in a production run, all of these elements resolve with a sharpness that gives the coin a presence entirely different from the softened, blurred impressions that tired dies produced as they wore through their service life. The copper-nickel alloy of the 1952 issue interacts with light differently than the wartime silver composition did, producing a luster on uncirculated examples that experienced collectors describe as brighter and more reflective in the fields, a cartwheel effect that spins across the coin's surface when it is tilted under a focused light source, and that disappears permanently the moment the coin enters circulation and friction begins replacing that delicate mint bloom with the duller, smoother surface of a coin that has been handled. Monticello on the reverse is where the 1952 Jefferson Nickel reveals its most important numismatic secrets, and the story those secrets tell depends entirely on how carefully you are willing to look, and how well you understand what you are looking for before you begin. The architectural rendering of Jefferson's Virginia home, the portico columns, the triangular pediment, the dome above, the flanking wings and surrounding landscape, was produced from dies that varied in their sharpness and their remaining life at the moment any given coin was struck, and that variation shows most dramatically in the steps at the base of the building. These horizontal lines, descending from the base of the portico, are among the shallowest design elements in the entire coin, which makes them the first features to suffer when die pressure drops, when the dies show fatigue, or when the planchet metal does not flow completely into every corner of the design cavity before the striking is complete. 1952 Philadelphia nickel, with 5 or 6 fully separated, clearly defined steps, the full steps designation that professional grading services award when their specific criteria for step separation and definition are met, is a significantly less common coin than the raw mintage figure of nearly 64 million would suggest, because the production conditions that produce full steps coins require a combination of fresh dies, properly prepared planchets, and optimal press settings that simply were not present for every coin in a high-volume commercial production run. When you find one, the steps resolve under magnification like architectural drawing rather than worn photograph, and that difference is not subtle to trained eyes. The minting variations that exist within the 1952 Jefferson Nickel series are the kind of details that separate casual coin handlers from dedicated numismatists, and they represent exactly the type of discovery that makes careful examination worthwhile even when the odds of finding a significant variety in any random coin seem long. Double die varieties, produced when the working die received misaligned impressions during its own manufacture, and subsequently transferred that doubling to every coin it struck, have been documented in the Jefferson Nickel series across multiple dates in the early 1950s, and while specific confirmed double dies for the 1952 Philadelphia issue are not among the most famous in the series, the methodology for finding them is consistent across all dates. Examine the lettering of Liberty and In God We Trust under quality magnification of at least 5 to 10 power. Look at the date numerals for any evidence of secondary impressions offset from the primary, and study Jefferson's eye and the details of his coat collar where double die effects tend to appear most visibly when they are present. The 1952 S, with its lower mintage of just over 20 million coins, has attracted particular specialist interest over the years because its relative scarcity in high grades makes premium examples more difficult to locate, and therefore more actively sought by collectors building complete Jefferson nickel sets in certified condition. Die varieties, repunched dates, and strike anomalies across all three 1952 mint issues exist in the specialist literature for this series, and the collector who approaches these coins with a reference guide and quality magnification is operating in a different category of engagement than someone who simply notes the date and moves on. The collector market for 1952 Jefferson Nickels operates on a value spectrum that most people who have simply spent these coins in commerce would find genuinely surprising, and understanding that spectrum requires thinking carefully about condition in a way that goes beyond the simple binary of old versus new. Circulated examples in grades from good through very fine coins that saw active commercial use across the 1950s, 1960s, and beyond before finding their way into collections or coin dealers' inventory, typically trade today for somewhere between 10 cents and $1, with the absence of silver content meaning there is no intrinsic metal premium to establish a floor the way wartime nickels have. Move into extremely fine and about uncirculated territory, where the design details remain sharp, but the mint luster has been partially or fully replaced by the softer surface of a coin that saw limited circulation, and realistic values for attractive, problem-free examples climb into the $2 to $15 range, depending on the specific mint mark, the eye appeal of the piece, and whether the coin shows any evidence of cleaning or environmental damage that would suppress its grade and market reception. Certified mint state examples graded by PCGS or NGC introduce a more interesting conversation. A 1952 Philadelphia nickel graded MS65 might bring $30 to $90 in current market conditions, while a 1952 S at the same grade commands more attention given its lower mintage, and examples at MS66 or above with full steps designations have appeared in auction archives at prices ranging from several hundred to over $1,000 for the finest certified survivors. These are estimates based on historical sales data and collector market observation, never predictions of what any individual coin will bring, because the numismatic market is shaped by forces no analysis can fully anticipate. There is a particular category of 1952 Jefferson nickel that exists in the collector consciousness as something genuinely exceptional. Coins that combine high certified grade with full steps designation and exceptional originality of surface, and the auction stories attached to these pieces carry the kind of tension that makes numismatic history feel surprisingly cinematic. Imagine a collector in the early 2000s quietly working through original bank rolls of 1952 S nickels acquired from a West Coast dealer who had purchased them from a California estate, examining each coin under a tensor lamp with practiced efficiency, setting aside the occasional gem while the rest went back into the dealer's inventory. The coins he selected were submitted to a grading service and came back with a mix of MS65 and MS66 grades, but two coins from the same original roll, struck from what appeared to be the same fresh die pair based on their matching sharpness and surface character, earned MS66 full steps designations that placed them among the finest certified examples of that date and mint in existence at that time. Those two coins eventually separated, one selling privately and one passing through a major auction where competing collectors pushed the final price into the mid-hundreds, an outcome that the seller had hoped for but never counted on, because the coin market rewards preparation and patience but guarantees nothing to anyone regardless of what the coin is or where it came from. That story is not unique in Jefferson nickel collecting, and it is not presented here as a template for expected outcomes. It is presented as evidence that the upper end of this market is real, active, and occasionally surprising in ways that make careful examination of any original, undisturbed 1952 nickel a worthwhile investment of attention. Examining a 1952 Jefferson nickel with genuine numismatic purpose requires a consistent, methodical approach that begins with the coin's physical characteristics and works progressively toward finer assessments of strike quality and potential variety attribution. Start with weight. A genuine 1952 nickel should register as close to 5 grams as your digital scale allows, and unlike the wartime issues where composition changes created diagnostic weight differences, the 1952 coin's standard copper-nickel alloy means that significant deviations from 5 grams are a meaningful flag for further investigation. Color in natural daylight is immediately informative. The copper-nickel composition produces a distinctly cooler, more purely metallic gray tone than the wartime silver issues, and a 1952 nickel that appears too warm, too yellow, or too silver tone deserves closer examination to confirm it is what it appears to be. Examine the rim under magnification all the way around the circumference of both sides, because an even, complete, well-defined rim indicates a properly prepared planchet and adequate striking pressure, while irregularities in rim height, completeness, or surface quality can indicate either production issues or postment damage that affects grade and value. Study the strike alignment by assessing whether the obverse and reverse designs are centered relative to the coin's physical edge. Meaningful misalignment, without the dramatic visual character of a genuine off-center mint error, may indicate a collar or feeding issue in the original striking process. And when you bring magnification to the lettering and design details, do so with patience rather than urgency, because the double die varieties and die anomalies that exist in this series do not announce themselves. They reveal themselves gradually to eyes that have learned to slow down and look carefully before drawing conclusions. The 1952 Jefferson Nickel sits in an interesting position within the broader collecting landscape, common enough that examples turn up regularly in inherited collections, old albums, and dealers' inventory, yet scarce enough in the grades that matter to serious collectors that a genuinely premium example represents a find worth taking seriously rather than setting aside without examination. Every original roll of early 1950s nickels that surfaces from an estate, every old Blue Whitman album pulled from a closet shelf, every accumulation of coins sorted by decade rather than by grade contains within it the possibility of an example that has survived 70-plus years in a condition that the collector market still values, not because such outcomes are common, but because they are real. They happen with enough regularity to justify careful attention. And they reward exactly the kind of patient, methodical examination that distinguishes a knowledgeable collector from someone simply moving coins from one container to another. Professional authentication and grading through PCGS, NGC, or another recognized service remains the essential step between an interesting find and a verified collectible, because the grade on a certified holder is not just an opinion, but a standardized, market-accepted statement about condition and authenticity that transforms a coin from a private curiosity into a tradable collectible with a defined place in the market hierarchy. The next coin we are going to examine carries a story that begins with a minting decision so unusual and so consequential that it created an entire category of collector pursuit that continues to this day. A coin whose most important characteristic is something you cannot see with the naked eye until you know exactly what to look for and where to find it. And when you do see it, you will not be able to look at this denomination the same way again. Step 6. Pick up a 1961 D Jefferson Nickel, and you are holding a coin that arrived in American circulation during one of the most electrically charged years of the 20th century, a moment when the United States was navigating the early tremors of the space race, when John F. Kennedy had just delivered an inaugural address that sent a current of possibility through the national consciousness. When the Berlin Wall was being constructed brick by brick as the Cold War hardened into permanent architecture, and when the everyday commerce of American life continued moving through diners and drugstores and hardware shops on the strength of coins exactly like this one. The Denver Mint produced approximately 229 million of these nickels in 1961, a figure that reflects the expanding American economy of the early Kennedy years and the sheer volume of coinage required to keep a consumer society functioning at the pace that post-war prosperity had established as normal. A D-mint mark, positioned beneath Monticello on the reverse in the understated style that characterized Denver's production identification throughout this era, is a small but meaningful detail that connects this coin to the high-altitude facility that had been striking American coinage since 1906, and that brought its own particular characteristics to the coins it produced, characteristics that specialists in the Jefferson Nickel series have spent decades learning to identify, compare, and evaluate against the output of the Philadelphia and San Francisco facilities that rounded out the production landscape of this period. The coin is composed of the standard alloy of 75% copper and 25% nickel that had returned to the series after the wartime silver experiment concluded in 1945, giving it that cool, composed gray tone that became the defining visual character of Jefferson Nickels through the late 1940s, the 1950s, and into the early 1960s, before the broader coinage disruptions of the mid-decade would begin reshaping American numismatic history in ways nobody yet anticipated. Felix Schlag's portrait of Thomas Jefferson dominates the obverse with the quiet authority it had carried since 1938, but examining a 1961 D-nickel through the lens of serious numismatic interest means looking past the familiarity of that portrait and into the specific quality of its execution on this particular date and mint. By 1961, the Jefferson Nickel design had been in continuous production for 23 years, and the accumulated knowledge of how to produce working dies from the master hub had settled into an established process. Yet that process still produced meaningful variation in strike quality from one die pair to the next, and the Denver Mint's output for 1961 reflects that variation across a production run of over 200 million coins. The obverse lettering, Liberty arching above Jefferson's portrait, In God We Trust along the left field, the date anchoring the lower right, appears with different degrees of sharpness depending on whether a given coin was struck from fresh dies at the beginning of their service life or from dies that had already impressed tens of thousands of coins and were beginning to show the fatigue that manifests as softened detail and slightly mushy letter edges. Jefferson's hair, with its carefully rendered queue and the individual strands that Schlag modeled from historical portraits and sculptural references, is one of the most diagnostically useful areas of the obverse for assessing strike quality, because those fine hair details disappear under die wear and striking pressure deficiencies in a way that the broader facial features do not. And a 1961 D-nickel, where Jefferson's hair resolves with individual strand definition rather than merging into undifferentiated texture, is already telling you something important about the quality of the coin you are holding. The reverse of the 1961 D-nickel carries Monticello in its established rendered form, and it is here that the most consequential distinctions between ordinary and exceptional examples of this date reveal themselves to patient examination. Denver's strike characteristics in the early 1960s are a subject that specialist collectors approach with specific expectations formed by years of studying certified populations and auction appearances. And the general observation within the hobby is that Denver production in this period could be inconsistent in ways that make fully struck, sharply detailed examples genuinely less common than the raw mintage numbers would naively suggest. The steps at the base of Monticello are the primary diagnostic feature that separates a standard collectible from a premium specimen in the certified market, and on 1961 D-nickels, finding examples where those steps resolve into 5 or 6 clearly separated horizontal lines rather than merging into a soft, undifferentiated mass at the building's base is a search that serious collectors conduct with the understanding that success requires examining many coins before the right one appears. The columns of the portico, the triangular pediment above them, the dome of the building rising behind, and the flanking wings of the structure all contribute to a holistic assessment of strike quality that experienced eyes evaluate as a unified impression rather than a series of isolated checkpoints. And a coin where all of those elements resolve with consistent sharpness across the entire reverse design is a coin that was struck well, from good dies, with adequate pressure. under conditions that the production environment did not always reliably provide across a run of this scale. The minting variations that exist within the 1961 D Jefferson Nickel series represent exactly the kind of numismatic territory that rewards collectors who bring magnification, reference materials, and genuine curiosity to their examination rather than simply sorting by date and moving on. Double die varieties in the Jefferson Nickel series of the late 1950s and early 1960s have been documented across multiple dates and mint marks. And while the most famous double dies in American coinage history tend to attract the most public attention, the collector literature for Jefferson Nickels contains references to more subtle doubling on obverse and reverse dies from this general period that appear on coins still circulating through the secondary market today. Examining the date numerals of a 1961 D nickel under quality magnification is a worthwhile exercise because the individual digits, particularly the 9 and the 1 at the end, can show secondary impressions offset from the primary when a double die was used in their production. And that doubling, once seen, is unmistakable to the eye that has learned what it looks like. The D mint mark itself is worth studying for evidence of repunching. A condition that occurs when the punch used to impress the mint mark into the working die was applied more than once with slight misalignment, leaving a ghost impression adjacent to or overlapping the primary letter, and repunched mint mark varieties from Denver's output in the early 1960s are documented in specialist references that serious Jefferson nickel collectors keep within reach when they sit down to examine coins with a loupe and adequate lighting. Condition is the variable that governs everything in the collector market for 1961 D Jefferson Nickels, and understanding the full range of what condition means for this specific date requires thinking about the different populations of surviving coins and how they arrived in their current state through very different paths across the 6+ decades since they were struck. The vast majority of 1961 D nickels that exist today are circulated coins, pieces that entered commerce immediately after leaving the Denver Mint and spent their active years as actual working currency, absorbing the friction of thousands of transactions before eventually being pulled from circulation by collectors, rolled by banks, or simply lost to the entropy that claims a meaningful percentage of every coin's production. These circulated examples, ranging from lightly worn pieces still showing most of their design detail to heavily abraded coins, where Monticello has softened into near legibility and Jefferson's portrait has flattened toward a generic profile, typically trade in the current market for amounts between 5 cents and a couple of dollars, collectible as date fillers for type sets, but not commanding any premium for the quality of their preservation. The more interesting conversation begins with original uncirculated examples, coins that left Denver in rolls or bags and were set aside without ever entering circulation, surviving in that original mint state through the intervening decades by luck, deliberate collection, or the accumulation habits of someone who saved coins without necessarily understanding their numismatic significance. These survivors, when they surface in the market today, are evaluated with a precision that circulated coins never require, because in mint state, the differences between grades matter enormously to certified values. The collector market for certified 1961 D Jefferson Nickels in mint state grades tells a story that moves from modest to genuinely significant as condition climbs and premium characteristics accumulate on a single coin. 1961 D nickel graded MS63 or MS64 by PCGS or NGC, representing a coin with full mint luster, but some contact marks or minor surface distractions from bag or roll handling, might realistically bring between $5 and $25 in current market conditions, a meaningful step above face value, but not the kind of number that generates serious collector excitement. Move into MS65 territory, where the coin must show strong luster, sharp strike, and only minimal distracting marks on the primary focal areas of the design, and realistic values for the 1961 D climb into the $30 to $80 range for attractive examples without the full steps designation. Add full steps to an MS65 1961 D nickel, and the market responds differently. Certified examples with that designation have appeared in auction archives at prices ranging from $100 to several $100s, depending on the specific characteristics of the coin, the competitive environment of the sale, and the overall demand for premium Jefferson nickel material at the time of the transaction. At MS66 full steps, a grade that represents genuinely exceptional preservation combined with outstanding strike quality, the 1961D enters the territory of serious specialist pursuit, with auction records for the finest certified examples reaching into the hundreds and occasionally beyond. Though all of these figures are drawn from historical market observation and represent estimates of what comparable coins have brought rather than predictions or guarantees of what any future transaction will produce, examining a 1961D Jefferson nickel responsibly means approaching the coin with a systematic methodology that covers the physical facts before moving into the more nuanced assessments of design quality and potential variety attribution. The coin should weigh 5 grams on a calibrated digital scale, and the copper-nickel alloy of this standard post-war composition has a density that a precision instrument will confirm within a tight tolerance on a genuine example. Anything significantly outside that expectation is a flag for further investigation rather than a conclusion in itself. Color in natural daylight should present as the cool, composed gray that characterizes the copper-nickel alloy, without the warmer undertones of the wartime silver composition or the yellower cast that can indicate unusual wear patterns, environmental exposure, or surface treatments that would affect grade. Examine the rim carefully under magnification, running your visual attention all the way around the circumference of both sides, because a well-produced coin from a properly maintained die and a correctly prepared planchet will show consistent rim height and definition, while deviations from that consistency can reveal production issues or postmint damage that matters to a professional grader. Strike alignment, the registration of the obverse and reverse designs relative to each other and relative to the coin's physical center, is worth assessing by checking whether the design sits centered within the rim on both sides, because misalignment that goes beyond normal tolerance can indicate a feeding or collar issue that may have produced a variety worth documenting. Bring your magnification to the lettering last, after you have assessed the broader characteristics, because the lettering examination requires the most focused attention and is most productively conducted when you already have a sense of the coin's overall quality and character from the wider assessment that preceded it. What makes the 1961D Jefferson Nickel a genuinely compelling subject for careful attention is the combination of historical moment, production context, and numismatic depth that it carries within a denomination most people handle without a second thought. A coin produced at the dawn of the Kennedy era in a country vibrating with a particular kind of nervous optimism, struck by the millions at a mint operating at full commercial capacity, and surviving into the present in a population that ranges from well-worn common coins to exceptional certified gems that serious collectors compete to own. The specialist who understands the full steps distinction, who knows the documented varieties for this date, who can assess strike quality by the resolution of Monticello's architectural details and the definition of Jefferson's hair. That collector is equipped to find something meaningful in a 1961D nickel that the casual observer would spend without hesitation. Professional authentication through a recognized grading service is always the responsible path before any significant buying or selling decision, because the certified grade is not simply an opinion, but a standardized market statement that converts a private assessment into a publicly recognized and tradable designation. And the difference between a coin that looks like an MS65 and one that actually is an MS65 to professional standards is a difference that only trained eyes and calibrated instruments can reliably determine, regardless of how experienced the individual examiner believes themselves to be.